Hello everyone and welcome back to Sociology. This week we'll be going over Chapter 4 and 5. Chapter 4 will look at the socialization, interaction, and theories of the self. And Chapter 5 will be focusing on group dynamics. This week I'm not asking you to read every part of both chapters. Instead, I have indicated on Blackboard what pages I would like you to read for both Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. So just be aware that you don't have to read the whole chapter for either one, because I know it's a lot of material and a lot of things to try to process. Okay, so Chapter 4, as I mentioned, we'll go over socialization, interaction, and the self. But before I get started, let's go over our learning objectives for this week. At the end of the lecture and reading, you should be able to understand the socialization process and be able to apply it to your own life. You should be able to identify various agents of socialization, and most of you have already talked about it in your discussion posts on culture, saying that you learn things through your parents, through school, through social media. Those are all agents of socialization, and we'll go over them a little bit more in depth this week. You should also be able to identify the theories of the self and match the key theorists to each of the theories. You should know the various aspects of groups, such as group roles, group dynamics, primary and secondary groups, and more. And that's part of the Chapter 5 section. And you should be able to identify and name the different types of conformity. Again, this is also in the Chapter 5 section. So, jumping into Chapter 4. Before we can really understand socialization and interaction and even the self, we need to understand human nature. So what is human nature? And oftentimes in psychology and sociology, we'll go over the nature versus nurture debate. And it's this idea that we're not sure whether we are born the way we are, whether it's in our genes, therefore it's biological, or whether it's learned through socialization, through interactions with others. And this debate asks us to determine which one is more important, which one determines individual behaviors and traits. So in a way, the nature versus nurture debate isn't really helpful because it doesn't take into account the fact that we both need our biology or our nature and our nurture and our socialization. Both of these things play a role in making us the people that we are. So, I'm sure you've heard from family members that they'll tell you, like, for example, that you act just like your father when you're angry. And you can figure out whether you've learned the trait, so you've learned to be angry, or whether you got that because it's biological and it was passed down from your dad to you through genes. And then some may even talk about acting like an aunt that they have never met. Others may give examples of acting like a sister, even though they were adopted from different biological families. So it's really, it's really hard to distinguish which factor is the most influential. So with that in mind, we need to at least examine the nurture part, and that's what Chapter 4 really goes over. It's the process of socialization and interaction. And socialization is the process of learning and internalizing the values, beliefs, and norms of our social group. So it also begins in infancy and lasts throughout the lifetime. Socialization doesn't end once you get to adulthood. And language facilitates socialization, much like it facilitates our understanding of culture. So we know that culture is passed from one generation to the next through language and communication, and socialization happens in a similar way. We're often told how to act or behave, which is how language facilitates this process. If people are deprived of socialization, for example, if they're raised in an isolation, then they may not exhibit behaviors that are typical of human beings. Children reared without much socialization are referred to as feral children because their behaviors are similar in some respects to those of a wild animal rather than a child. Okay, so now that we know the process of socialization and that we really need interactions to go throughout our daily lives, otherwise we would be like wild animals, and that language is key, we also need to learn about the theories of the self. So we need to know more about who we are and how we become who we are. So the self is our experience of a personal identity that is separate and different from all other people. Sociologists believe that the self is created and modified through interaction with others over the course of one's life. In other words, when we get a positive response from other people, we might like the feeling we get, and so we will try to replicate that feeling. This might even help to shape our personality or our sense of self. Therefore, our interactions with other people may actually shape our own sense of self. And so, one of the more famous people in psychology that is associated with theories of the self is Sigmund Freud. And like I said, I know a lot of you are psychology students, so you're going to hear a lot about him. And a lot of it's not going to be positive. So, but he actually helped sociologists too gain a better understanding of social behavior. And so Freud developed the idea of the subconscious mind and the unconscious mind, which he believed controlled most of our drives, impulses, thoughts, and behaviors. It is widely acknowledged that Freud was among the most important social thinkers of the 20th century. Many of his ideas, from the Freudian slip of the ego trip, have become part of the common vernacular. Freud was interested not only in individual minds, but also in the way that mental processes have influenced the whole of history and culture. In one of his works, Freud explains that individual psychology helps to create social order and is also simultaneously constrained by society's structures and demands. And he divided the self into 3 different categories: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id was the one that wanted to act on impulse. It's the part of ourselves that just automatically want to do something. Kind of like when we see candy, the first thing we want to do is go eat it. Or if you're a girl and you want to go shopping, I mean, that's like an impulse buy, right? So you see something, you want it, you buy it. That's your id working on you. The ego is you right now. The ego controls the superego and the id. The superego is actually our conscious. It's our mind. It's the thought process that goes on. And the superego, in a way, tries to balance out the impulses of the id. I know this is really confusing, so I didn't really bring it in the slides, and I don't expect you to know it for the exams or anything like that. But if you are a psychology major, you're going to have to learn a lot about Sigmund Freud and his theories. Moving on, so Charles Cooley also helped us understand the self. He believed that the sense of self depends on seeing oneself reflected in interactions with others, and he refers to it as the looking glass self. And that's the notion that the self develops through our perception of others' evaluations and appraisals of us. In other words, we like getting a positive response from people, so we try to replicate our actions when the response we received was positive. We use others as a mirror. In this example, when we style our hair and look in the mirror, we wait for the person looking back to say, "That looks good," and then we will decide that we like our style. So in other words, it's basically focusing on our perceptions of ourselves is just based on how others perceive us. So if our friends perceive us as smart and funny, then that's how we're going to see ourselves. Another theory of the self is from George Herbert Mead, which you learned a little bit about when we read on the sociological theories, and he expanded on Cooley's ideas. Mead also believed that the self is created through social interaction and that this process starts in childhood as children begin to acquire language skills. So again, key point here, language is useful and necessary. So Mead believed that the self develops through 3 stages: the preparatory stage, the play stage, which is taking the role of the significant other, and the game stage, in which children learn to take the perspective of the generalized other. So As I said, Mead believed that children began to develop a sense of self at about the same time that they began to learn language. The first stage, the preparatory stage, is the development of this as where children mimic or imitate others. And you see this a lot, like if you have a nephew or a sibling that's younger than you, or a niece or something, and they're at that young baby stage or even toddler stage, and you smile at them, more than likely they're going to smile back. And that's just an instant reflex that they do. They mimic you and try to be like you. And that is the first stage. The second stage in Mead's theory of the development of self is the play stage, where children pretend to play the role of a particular or significant other. Now, significant other is not, boyfriend, girlfriend in this case. It's just someone that is significant to them, like their mom or dad or their siblings. And that person demonstrates the perspectives and expectations of various particular roles, which the children learns and internalizes. And then the third stage is the game stage, where children play organized games and take on the perspective of the generalized other. So this would be when children start to play, play games like girls pretend that they're moms and that they're married and that they have kids, and they play out the roles that a mom would play out, like vacuuming and cleaning and cooking. That is them trying to take on the perspective of the generalized other. So, all in all, it's this process of recognize the dual nature of the self, taking the role of the particular other or the significant other, the person that they learn from, and seeing the perspective from their perspective, that makes this theory really unique. And so Mead suggested that all of these things, the particular other and the generalized other, actually leads to the development of the self. Another theory of the self is the Thomas theorem. W.I. Thomas stated that if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. So this is now called the Thomas theorem. Because we encounter ambiguous situations every day, many meanings are possible. So the way that we define each situation is what actually becomes reality. For example, suppose you're walking down the street and you witness a woman slapping a man in public. What are the possible meanings of that situation? It could be a fight or spousal abuse. It could be a joke or a friendly greeting, depending on how hard the slap is. It could be that he has just passed out and she's hoping to revive him. Or the participants could be actors showing a scene from a film. Each of these definitions leads to a different set of potential consequences. You might intervene, call the police, stand by and laugh, ignore them, summon paramedics, or ask for an autograph, depending on which meaning you act upon. Each definition of the situation lends itself to a different approach, and the consequences are real. Sociologists call this process social construction. The last theory of the self is from Erving Goffman, which we talked about when we looked at the sociological theories, and I mentioned dramaturgy. Erving Goffman believed that meaning is constructed through interaction. His approach, called dramaturgy, compares social interaction to the theater, where individuals take on roles and act them out for an audience. Goffman saw social life as a sort of game where we work to control the impression others have on us, a process he called impression management. So, according to Goffman, we work hard and go out of our way to present a favorable impression to the people around us. Our appearance, mannerism, and dress can all contribute to or undermine our performance to others. This is kind of the front stage, backstage thing that I talked about in the sociological theory lecture. So your backstage isn't how you would present yourself to others. The front stage is if you were in a theater and it's a play, you want to present yourself how the story's supposed to go calm, collected, cool, confident. And then the backstage is you just running around like a chicken with its head cut off, essentially. You have no idea what's going on and you're stressed and you have all this anxiety, but you don't want others to see that. And you don't want others to see the bad side of you. And so that, in a way, is impression management. So now that we've finished up on theories of the self, we also realize that socialization is necessary and important, and we learn how to socialize by interacting with others. So now we're going to look at the agents of socializations, which are the social groups, institutions, and individuals that provide structured situations where socialization occurs. Major agents can include family, schools, peers, and the media. Each of these agents of socialization, sometimes referred to as agencies of socialization, it doesn't really matter which one you use, but each of these agents of socialization has a different impact on us depending on where we are in the lifespan. For instance, the family is very influential for young children, but older children and adults are heavily influenced by their peers. And we'll talk more about these agents of socialization in the next few slides. So the family. The family is the single most significant agent of socialization in all societies and teaches us the basic values and norms that shape our identity. The family has significant influence on children until they go to school. The family is often considered a primary agent of socialization, and school is often considered a secondary agent. Schools provide education and socialize us through a hidden curriculum, which is one of the things that I brought up in one of your discussion questions. So the hidden curriculum is a set of values and behaviors such as punctuality, neatness, discipline, hard work, competition, and obedience. These things teach many of the behaviors that we consider to be important later in life, but it's not something that teachers have a course on. You don't have a course on hard work or competition. You just learn it through this hidden curriculum. And as I mentioned previously, schools are often considered the secondary agent of socialization. However, they sometimes replace the family as the most important agent, as children in school experience socialization from adults and other children outside of the family. So now peers become pretty important, especially when kids reach the teenage years age or they go on into their adult life. Peers provide very different social skills and often become more immediately significant than the family. Peers are often the most influential agent of socialization for older children and adults. Another agent of socialization, which many of you have touched on in the previous discussion week, when we talked about culture. A lot of you stated that our values are transmitted through media or social media, and that is correct. I mean, it is an agent of socialization. Mass media has become an important agent of socialization, often overriding the family and other institutions and instilling values and norms. So you guys got that correct. Woohoo! The media is also probably the most controversial agent of socialization. We know that children and individuals do learn from the media, but there is no comparable society exactly like that in the United States that doesn't have mass media. So it's difficult to make a comparison or determine exactly how much impact the media has on us. So, I don't know, one way you can think of it is to ask yourself which one you think has the largest impact on you, or had the largest impact on you as a child, then as a teenager, and now as a young adult. So has the agents of socialization, have some of them become more important as you grew up? These are questions that you can ask yourself to try to picture the steps, the process. And so going through media, we interact online too, through social media. Sociologists are interested in interactions that occur in copresence, which is when individuals are in one another's physical presence, and the way that modern technology enables us to interact with people very far away. So relationships used to be based mainly on physical proximity. But we are now as likely to form non-territorial relationships based on common interests and access to technology that keeps people together even when they are physically apart. And so postmodern theorists claim that the role of technology in interaction is one of the primary features of postmodern life. We are now exposed to many more points of view that help us shape our sense of self than the generations before us. So, postmodern theorists like Kenneth Gorgan believe that interacting through technology exposes us to more information and diverse perspectives, which may shape our sense of self and socialize us in new ways. This is another reason why the media is a controversial agent of socialization. There's also the saturated self, which is a postmodern idea that the self is now developed by multiple influences chosen from a wide range of media sources. And lastly, we have adult socialization. So adults are not completely socialized. It's not something that, you just grow up, you reach adulthood, and then you're done. Adults will always have socialization because resocialization happens often. They have changes in life circumstances, such as moving to a new community or losing a job, that results in learning new behaviors. For instance, you can be resocialized when you enter or leave the military or take on a new role, like becoming a spouse or a parent. So, resocialization in that sense is the process of replacing previously learned norms and values with new ones as a part of a transition in life. A dramatic form of resocialization takes place in a total institution, which is an institution such as prisons or cults or mental hospitals. And these institutions cut individuals off from the rest of society so that their lives can be controlled and regulated. So, now that we've gone over the agents of socialization, really the last couple things that I want to touch on is statuses and roles. So, a status is a position in society that comes with a set of expectations. We have the ascribed status, the embodied status, the achieved status, and our master status. An ascribed status is one we are born with that is unlikely to change. So, let's think of an example here. Your hair color. Unless you dye it, it's not going to change. Your skin color also is not going to change. Those are things that you are born with. An embodied status is one that is located in our physical selves. An embodied status could involve being tall or short or having an attractive smile. An achieved status is one where we have learned through our individual effort or that is imposed by others. An achieved status could involve a professional position like manager or chief executive officer, CEO. And our master status is a status that seems to override all others and affects all other statuses that we possess. So, for example, it's possible that your college life, being a college student, will become your master status. It will override all the other statuses that you have, and it will bleed into other areas of your life. You'll form friendships in OU that you might not have if you hadn't gone. So oftentimes you'll hear a person being called by his or her master status. For instance, you may hear people talking about that black man. In that example, the description black came before describing the person as a man. Black is likely to be the master status. You also hear things like disabled individual or stupid kid. The first word is usually the master status. It tends to be the status that people notice above all others. Now, I'm not saying that these characteristics are great or that we should use these when talking to people, but it is often used in languages and conversations regardless of what we do. Roles are the sets of behaviors expected from a particular status. And so you have certain roles as a graduate, or not a graduate student, I'm sorry, I'm a graduate student. As a college student, you have roles that you have to fulfill. You have to go to your classes and complete the necessary assignments and pass on to the next level. As a worker, if you work at a restaurant or something, your roles there are to show up on time, to do your job, whatever that may be. And it's not really to be friends or be friendly at all, but that's not your role. And sometimes roles can conflict with one another. And this is when the roles associated with one status clash with the roles associated with a different status. So, role conflict happens when a person has two different roles to perform and they conflict with one another. So, if you are a student and you have a job, and your class and job both are at the same time, that's a role conflict because you can't be in two places at once. Another example is if you are a mother and a student. You might have class today and your child might have a soccer game at the same time. You have to choose between your two roles because they conflict with one another. Role strain occurs when roles associated with a single status clash, so it's different. With role strain, you have only one role that has multiple conflicting expectations. As another example, you are a student, and suppose you know that you are supposed to study tonight. However, there is also a party tonight. Your roommates pressure you to go to the party because that's what college students are supposed to do, and you have to choose. The one role, college student, is pulling you in two different directions. So either of these processes, role conflict and role strain, either one of them may lead to role exit. And role exit is where we leave behind a role we once occupied in order to resolve the role conflict. So if you're a student and you have a job and they conflict with one another, you may just decide to quit that job and try a new one that is at a different time so that you can manage both of them. Or maybe you just decide that you're not going to work at all because you're a full-time student. That is a role exit because you are essentially leaving your job. So that concludes chapter 4, but we're not done. We have to go over chapter 5, which looks at life in groups. So what is a group? A group is a collection of people who share some attribute, identify with one another, and interact with each other. Social groups provide the values, norms, and rules that guide people's lives. So these criteria are very important, as we will see. Sometimes a bunch of people in proximity might look like a group, but if they aren't meeting these criteria, they would not be considered a group by sociologists. So here we go. Unlike a group, a crowd is a temporary gathering of people in a public place. These individuals do not identify with each other and they will not remain in contact, even though they are essentially all together in one place. A crowd is an example of an aggregate, which is a collection of people who share a physical location but do not have lasting social relations. So although the term groups and crowds are often used interchangeably in society, you can see that they are actually quite different from one another. For example, if you see a bunch of people in the cafeteria waiting in line for lunch, you would likely consider them a crowd rather than a group. You would likely see an aggregate at an airport or in line for a ride at a theme park. You may also see an aggregate in front of a car accident or other event because people tend to gawk at an unusual sight. So crowds and aggregates are very different from groups because groups share some attributes that they share or similar interests. And so we have two different types of groups. We have primary groups and secondary groups. Primary groups usually involve the most face-to-face interaction and cooperation and the deepest feelings of belonging. So with primary groups, we tend to express a full range of emotions. We wouldn't necessarily be comfortable expressing all of our emotions to just anyone, but our primary groups are intimate and we have a deeper bond with them than other groups, which typically allows us to be more open. And so in primary groups, we are closely associated with the other members. And examples of primary groups include family and friends. Secondary groups are larger and less personal and are usually organized around a specific activity or task. We usually don't feel a strong emotional tie to our secondary groups. We may share an interest or common goal, but we rarely have deep feelings of belonging with these people. Classmates may sometimes be an example of a secondary group, and coworkers may also fit into this category, because oftentimes you will have group projects or you'll have to work together, but you don't really have a strong emotional tie to your coworkers or your classmates. They're just people that you'll see until the end of the semester or until your job is over. With that in mind, we should also examine social networks, which is the web of direct and indirect ties connecting an individual to other people who may also affect you. So you and your family, friends, peers, colleagues, teachers, and coworkers constitute your social network. These are all the individuals that you would interact with. Research on social networks has shown that indirect ties can be as important as direct ties. So it's not just whom you know that matters, but whom they know as well. Sometimes you are able to make connections through others, which can lead you to friends, employment opportunities, or even a love relationship. A social network is a structure made up of individuals and groups tied together by different types of relationships. Since groups provide values, norms, and rules that guide people's lives, it is possible that the modern world disconnects people from their groups and creates feelings of enmity or normlessness. Sociologists such as Emil Durkheim and Robert Putnam have worried that the modern world creates a lack of connection, while others argue that these worries are overstated and that new technologies like the internet allow us to connect with others in new ways. So our groups are important, and groups also have dynamics or specific attributes. And so group dynamics are the patterns of interaction between groups and individuals. This includes the way groups form and fall apart, as well as the way groups influence their members. Adding or subtracting just one person from a group can completely change the group dynamics. You might be able to think of a class that you've had in which there was a student who had a unique personality, which could be good or bad. So, what was the class like when that student was absent? Not having that student there would change the class dynamic. We also have in-groups and out-groups. An in-group is a group that a person identifies with and feels loyalty toward. In-groups can be thought of as us, and out-groups are groups that a person feels opposition towards, or rivalry or hostility. So while the in-groups include us, the out-groups can be thought of as them. Most of us are associated with a number of in-groups and out-groups based on our ethnic, religious, familial, professional, or educational backgrounds. We also have reference groups, which are groups that provide a standard of comparison against which people evaluate themselves. Our reference group might be our friends or family. However, it could also be the mass media. Many people argue that the reason we see so much over-dieting, anorexia, and bulimia and plastic surgery in individuals is due to the media's portrayal of images of men and women that are so perfect as to be basically unobtainable by regular people. Yet, because we want to look like them and because we use them as a reference group, we often try to modify ourselves to appear like them. With that in mind, though, we do have group cohesion and groupthink. And so group cohesion is the sense of solidarity or loyalty that individuals feel toward a group to which they belong. You can think of cohesion as the social glue that binds us and holds our groups and societies together. A group is more cohesive when the individual members feel strongly tied to the group, but too much cohesion can lead to the kind of poor decision-making called groupthink. Groupthink is the tendency of very cohesive groups to enforce a high degree of conformity among members, creating a demand for unanimous agreement. Groupthink sometimes develops in large companies when individuals are pressured to agree with the group so they stop offering novel ideas, which can cause the company to falter. Some companies try to combat this with their think tanks, where individuals are encouraged to brainstorm and come up with new ideas. Okay, so like I talked about on the previous slide, we do have peer pressure, and that can occur when we experience groupthink. Peer pressure is the influence of one's fellow group members on individual attitudes and behaviors. So this is actually very common in our society, and people feel pressure to fit in, and they don't often, so they will follow popular trends or go along with the idea of friends as a result. Adolescents in particular often feel tremendous pressure to fit in and sometimes make choices that aren't in their best interest because they are influenced by others. It is fairly common to hear stories in the news about teens who get into trouble. How often is this attributed to peer pressure? So generally we conform to group norms because we want to gain acceptance and approval, which are positive sanctions, and we want to avoid rejection and disapproval, which are negative sanctions. Social influence or peer pressure can lead to a conflict between group norms and individual norms. Honor killings can be used as an example of this conflict. Specifically, the murder of someone, often considered the Kim Kardashian of Pakistan, could be addressed. So, like Kandil Baloch. And so, with peer pressure also comes conformity, because many times people will give in to peer pressure. And there are several types of conformity. There's compliance, identification, and internalization. Compliance is the mildest form of conformity, and it includes actions to gain reward or avoid punishment. So, for example, you're in the car with friends and they turn on the radio. The band that's playing is awful, but all your friends sing along. They ask if you like the song and you reply, "Yeah, this is great." Even though you don't like it, you show compliance to fit in. Identification is a type of conformity where you establish or maintain a relationship with a person or group. For instance, later with that same group of friends, you go to the mall and you buy a t-shirt from the band that you heard in the car. While you didn't really like the music, the fact that you have the shirt means that you're exhibiting identification to fit in and be even closer to your group of friends. The last type of conformity is internalization, and this is the strongest type of conformity. This occurs when an individual adopts the beliefs or actions of a group and makes them his or her own. So if we go back to that same example of you and your friends, after several weeks, one day you turn on the radio and, much to your surprise, you find yourself singing along to the band that you didn't like. You've used internalization to make the group norms your own. So while conformity can have its downsides, there's also teamwork, which is quite useful. Teamwork occurs when a group outperforms an individual. So a group almost always outperforms an individual, but rarely performs as well as it could in theory. A group's efficiency usually declines as its size increases, because organizing takes time and social loafing increases with group size. So I know a lot of you probably don't know what a social loafing is, and that's okay. Social loafing means that as more individuals are added to a group responsible for a task, each successive addition contributes a little less. So the more people that become involved, the harder it will be to discern individual effort. If it is impossible for any single person to receive credit or blame, motivation usually will suffer. And teams can also be a part of our identity. Group leaders can increase efficiency by recognizing individual effort or by increasing a member's social identity, which is the degree to which they identify with the group. So that was a lot of material. We went over socialization, the process of socialization, theories of the self, roles, statuses, groups, group dynamics, and conformity and teamwork. So because that is so much material, please let me know if you have any questions with it. You can come to my office hours, you can email me, either one will work. Just let me know if you have any problems or if you don't understand the material. So what's left to do for the week? You need to finish reading this week's assigned readings, which includes Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. You need to complete the inquisitive quiz for Chapter 4. This will be due by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, September 27th. You also need to participate in discussion 4 and respond to at least one classmate. This will be due by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, September 27th as well. If you'd like to plan ahead, you can. You'll need to study for Exam 1, as that will be your only thing to do next week. There are flashcards and key term reviews available on Blackboard to help you study. They're on the left-hand menu, so when you go into the sociology course, you can scroll down past course content, past the weekly to-dos, and you'll eventually find flashcards and review key term options. I've also included next week, well, this Sunday actually, the material for week 6 will pop up. There will be no new material, but it will tell you what the exam covers and the topics that it covers so that you can kind of tailor your studying to specific topics. And like I said, come to office hours if you have any questions. All right, everyone, I hope you have a great week, and let me know if you have any problems.